everyone, and welcome to the Open Contracting session of the 2021 OGP Academy, the case for open government. My name is Camila Salazar of the Open Contracting Partnership, and on behalf of the Open Government Partnership, the Korean Development Institute School of Public Policy, and the Open Contracting Partnership, I thank you all for joining. In this session today, leading scholars will review the latest research into the impact of open contracting. We will learn about the evidence on how open contracting has led to improving value for money and promoting fair and open access to public contracts, and also about the field's strengths, gaps, and limitations. We will hear about methodologies to measure equality and social inclusion in public procurement, the level of awareness and usage of contracting data by citizens, and the risks of lack of transparency in infrastructure contracts, and how all this relates with open government and what future research may look like. I am delighted to be joined today by our speakers, Dr. Mihály Fazekas from the Central European University, researcher Scarlett George, Adriana Romero Barreto from the Anti-Corruption Institute in Colombia, and Said Tafida from Follow Taxes in Nigeria. And all of these panelists have been studying and working on today's topics in a wide range of research projects and policy interventions. And you can read their full bios in the Uber platform there. So, as you know, OGP and OCP are in a constant mission to stay up to date on the evidence on what works and how on open government generally and open contracting in particular. And public contracting is the world's largest marketplace, covering around $13 trillion of spending every year. Open contracting has become a global norm, with institutions, governments, and different stakeholders implementing and promoting open contracting reforms globally. For this reason, we are honored to have Dr. Mihály Fazekas today with us to present his research review on the state of evidence on major public procurement reforms and their impact. And following his presentation, grantees of Open Contracting's program about action research will address specific case studies on how these findings relate to the experience of implementing and studying open contracting reforms in different contexts. In addition to that, OGP and OCP are currently collaborating in conducting a literature review that can help both institutions guide their stakeholders into transforming evidence into action. And this paper will be published in early 2022. So we welcome your participation in the Q&A section after the panel, as today's discussion will continue to inform this research as it is finalized. So to start the discussion, I want to introduce you to Dr. Mihály Fazekas, who is a professor at the Central European University and also a director at the Government Transparency Institute, where he specializes on big data methods to understand the quality of government globally. So welcome, Mihály, and it's great to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Camila, and really happy to be here. I hope you see my shared slides. I must admit I'm in a pretty bad shape, so I'm not turning on my camera. I have had my booster shot against COVID yesterday, and I'm still having a slight fever, so I'm really eager to be here, but I will not show my best face. I'm sorry for that, but hopefully still, you know, interesting overview of the kind of work and evidence we identified in this space. So as Camila mentioned, I would like to offer a brief overview of our systematic review on evidence on public procurement interventions aimed to improve competition, so open access, open competition, and also aimed at lowering corruption risk, improving integrity. This is a work I have done together with a colleague from the World Bank, Jürgen René Blum, and also the initial funding was offered by the World Bank. Let me drop here the link in the chat to the paper. So if you find my presentation remotely interesting, then you can have a look at the paper. There's a lot more interesting detail in there. So First, let me offer a brief overview, a sort of big picture of where we are in terms of evidence on various interventions in public procurement. And then I will pick out just two interventions which are widely praised and considered as good interventions. And I will pick these two just to show how realities are a lot more complex than just a one tweet, one sentence long support for an intervention, because these interventions tend to have complex and often contradictory impacts on different outcomes we care about. As a very quick methods point I want to make, we looked for systematic evidence. We looked for high quality, typically quantitative papers, which don't just rely on a single case study or a couple of interviews or very narrow empirical evidence. Rather, we looked for studies which have ideally experimental setup, which is usually very strong in identifying causal effects. Or if it's not experimental, then ideally we looked for quasi-experimental, so looking for natural experiments. That's the sort of methodology which for which Nobel Prize was given this year. So really try to narrow our focus on the most reliable types of studies, which didn't work all the time, because in some cases we had very little to go on, but most of the cases we could rely on such studies. And I will show you a few examples of the power of this kind of analysis. So the big picture as a starting point, overall, it's not a jungle of high quality studies of fantastic evidence which we can draw on. Rather, in general, there is little systematic evidence on a lot of interventions, and there are some bright spots of greenery, if you like, bright spots of a couple of high quality papers. And I must underline that really had as a vision in mind the sort of evidence base, which is not relying on a single study or two studies, but a set of studies for each intervention, so that we can be confident that our policy conclusions, our policy recommendations are not driven by idiosyncrasies of one or two contexts, one or two particular intervention. Now, beyond this image of a desert with a few green spots, there is also a problem that most evidence comes from OECD countries. There is some, and increasingly so, evidence from developing countries, but that's kind of still in the early stages. So here is a quick overview of the different interventions we evaluated, for which we looked for evidence. The first group of interventions target specific procurement phases. So they look at, for example, the reward mechanism. For example, they look at how setting up framework agreements can have a positive effect or a negative effect. Whereas there is a second group of interventions which are not focused on one particular phase of the procurement process, rather target the whole framework, the whole policy area. Transparency and watchdog portals tend to be of this sort, but also professionalization, audits, and monitoring tend to target the whole procurement cycle. Now, what you see here is a couple of countries from which we have evidence. That's the third column, right after intervention name. And then we have the quality of evidence, with green being those areas where we have a good range of different studies looking at the same sort of questions with comparable outcomes, comparable designs. Very few interventions have this green next to it, so very few areas where we have good enough evidence. These are the green spots, the bright spots in the desert. Then there is a bulk of the interventions where we have some evidence, either one or two studies or maybe more studies, but of questionable scientific quality. And there are some areas which I was very surprised to see professionalization and capacity development, where there is a lot of hope and dream and promise, but very little systematic evidence which we could draw on. So that's the kind of quality of evidence overview. But then, what do we see of the results in the identified high quality studies? So we see that effects vary widely, and one effect which we could compare across studies was the effect size % savings. And then here we have some interventions which have quite high savings potential, up to 50%, but most successful interventions only save between 1% and 5%. So that sort of puts in context what we can expect from success in public procurement. So very quickly, e-procurement intervention. E-procurement is among the e-government tools, which is one of the most widely implemented, applied tool all across high, middle, and low income countries. However, these e-procurement systems tend to focus on the early stages of the procurement process, announcing tenders, providing tender documentation, and submission of bids. A lot less on submitting invoices, a lot less on monitoring contract implementation. This is 5 years old tally, but the picture is relatively similar even today. So what do we expect from e-procurement? We expect positive as well as negative effects. We expect e-procurement or electronic government procurement to increase efficiency. It's just no longer needs to push around papers, just a click of a button, things go from one computer to another. That saves a lot on administrative costs. But of course, IT skills get in the way, so it actually can increase administrative cost, decrease efficiency if the users cannot navigate the system. Then there is a positive effect of reducing non-intentional barriers, so barriers to competition which are not related to corruption or market protectionism. And that's, accessibility of tenders and opportunities on the web just increases that sort of entry by companies. But again, if IT skills are limited, firms might not be able to make use of this. Then corruption is a little harder to do in e-procurement, not much, a little. So we expect integrity to increase, even though there might be displacement effects or just more advanced forms of corruption. And finally, procurement systems generate the sort of data which demand science or societal accountability strongly needs. So here's a comparison between 3 high-quality quasi-experimental studies from India, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. And they look at a range of outcomes from access to competition, to economy and efficiency of administrative efficiency. And you could see the picture is quite mixed, even though the interventions look comparable. The number of bids did not increase in India and Indonesia as a result of increasing e-procurement, but we found a quite big effect in Bangladesh. Then we can see no effect on time and cost overruns. So if there's an intervention for I'm finishing soon. So if there's an intervention targeting the competition, the tendering phase of the procurement cycle, then probably the effect is null or even negative for time and cost overruns. Then what is even more surprising, the total length of running tenders did not change in India. It increased in Indonesia, but quite substantially, and decreased in Bangladesh. So there is no clear-cut result when it comes to administrative efficiency. So civil society supervision, I'm just running through this very quickly. Civil society supervision of contract implementation, and this is an experimental study from Indonesia, where audit and the invitation of citizens was compared. And again, the picture is very mixed. We have audit decreasing, missing materials as a sign of corruption, but invitations, so greater involvement of locals in local road construction monitoring, that had not resulted in any measurable decrease in stolen materials. That probably is because it's very hard to observe these things. But missing wages, so people getting paid for not doing their work, that decreased quite substantially as a result of involving local citizens in monitoring. And that's probably because something is that is something which is more easily observable. So there is a risk of elite capture. I would like to conclude with that. So depending on what are the goals of the local groups, the citizens and the local elites, the effect of local monitoring of contract implementation may vary. It might be positive, negative, or null effect. Thank you very much, and sorry for overrunning a bit.
Thank you so much, Mihály, for your presentation, which I think highlights the big picture of research and interventions currently in public procurement that I know a lot of governments have implemented globally. So it shed light on what types of interventions work and what are the key gaps and how we could address them. So I want to remind the audience that you can add the questions in the Q&A function, because we will have a section at the end to answer some questions. And to continue the conversation on these topics, as I mentioned, we also invited 3 researchers from an action research program by OGP, which focus on projects analyzing inclusion, efficiency, and transparency in public procurement globally. So I want to introduce you next to Adriana Romero, who is a director of studies in public policy at the Anti-Corruption Institute in Colombia. And she led a research that analyzed contract level data associated with the development of public works in Colombia, comparing red flags performance between public contracts awarded under different contracting rules in terms of transparency. So thank you, Adriana, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias, Camila.
Thank you so much, Camila. Good morning to all of you. It's an honor to be able to share with you all here in this space our experience to provide these services in Colombia. I'd like to share with you the investigation, the research that we did in 2021 on public works. And I'd start explaining that the framework for public procurement in Colombia is divided into 3 groups. First, we have the group that follows the statute for public procurement, which is the law governing public procurement in Colombia. And then we have a second group, which has a heterogeneous regime, and that's called the special regime for procurement. So what types of entities can use these regimes? Well, we have public institutions that are competing with the private sector, or institutions that carry out their activities in regulated markets, or markets that are a bit more monopolistic. And what we see is that the institutions that use these special regimes are very regulated in Colombia. We have the general statute as well as the laws for procurement, and they use the same methods for procurement and publish the information on the public procurement portals in Colombia. But when it comes to open data, the difference is that the SECOP portal, which is the public procurement portal, doesn't register the type of contract that was awarded, but it does do so for the contracts that are awarded through the statute for procurement. So this is a very important variable in order to observe the factors for hiring a contractor, and it also allows us to see how competitive this process is. So for example, when it's direct, we see more discretion and there's a higher risk of corruption. But if there's a public bid, then we see that there's a variety of requirements to select the best offer. And we see that the requirements are all different. There are so many special public procurement regimes and entities monitoring them. So this is a pretty big issue. Between January and March 2021, we saw that about $850 million were awarded for public works through these different contracts. And we see that this was significant for the period that we monitored. And this time, it represented 48% of the contracts in public works. So in this context, the use of special regimes for public procurement tell us about the transparency in public procurement in Colombia, and we see that there could be inefficiencies in investing this money or risks of corruption. So that is why we carried out this research of red flags throughout these different groups. We used the case study for public works because we saw that there were inefficiencies in procurement in this sector. We saw that there were delays in shipments, or we saw that small and medium-sized companies were having a hard time entering the sector, and this is a situation that can lead them to bankruptcy quite easily. So what did we do? Well, the first thing that I want to mention is that we found that the contracts provided through these special regimes are shorter and have a higher sum than those that are awarded through the statute for public procurement. In 14% of the Colombian municipalities, we see that procurement through these special regimes is predominant, and in 18%, we saw no use of special regimes for contracting in the sector of public works. Then, through these objectives, we saw that 42% of the items analyzed showed that there is a higher sum to those contracts awarded through these special procurement regimes. So we look at the market, and if we say it's 25% of the value, then we saw that while the contracts that were granted through the general statute of procurement, we saw that there were 2 points, and 10% of those contracts were above that 25% benchmark under these special regimes. So the analysis that we carried out based on municipalities, and well, here I'd like to share a slide that is going to explain this a bit more. We saw that 2.7% of the municipalities in the country were able to have 10 or less contracts based on this regime for special procurement. And this allows us to see the lack of involvement by the state in these areas. But this map shows us that approximately 76% of the areas that we were analyzing see that there is this market with special regimes. And this is significant because we see that the use of special procurement regimes is contributing to the concentration of the market, and we would not have this if we used normal procurement regimes. So now there was a third analysis that we carried out. This was the temporal analysis, and we wanted to see how this pattern changed as the COVID-19 restrictions varied. So in March 2020, we saw that there was an increase in the public work contracts. We saw it was higher here for the special regimes, and we compared this with the general statute. Now we look at public works and we see it slowed down during the first months of strict quarantine, but at the end of the year, at the end of these restrictions, the procurement accelerated again. And since we analyzed from 2018 to 2020, we were able to see that a high amount of contracts granted to these special regimes were done through direct procurement. So we detected very atypical growth between January to June 2019. This was a year after a law for electoral guarantees, which does not allow for direct voting for the presidential elections. So this changed the way that the special and regular procurement regimes are impacted. So we can only explain the trend that we saw due to what had happened a year before, where we saw that direct procurement was adopted. And this is really important to note. The special procurement regime is making some markets more monopolistic, but it could also be influencing towards the use of direct procurement without citizens being able to do anything. And this also creates a higher risk of corruption because, as you all know, direct procurement is really discretionary. So what can we say? Well, we see that we need to evaluate the use of special procurement regimes in Colombia, and we have to look at this specifically in the sector of public works due to the different procurement laws that exist, such as in the general statute, which is the law that should be applied. We also have to look at procurement in public works. This should be done through open bids, open tendering, and we see that all of these entities are participating. And we also have to support citizens so that they can seek mechanisms to generate more transparency, or at least allow them to understand all of the different procurement regimes that exist so that they can have a say in the development of public works in Colombia. And to conclude, I wanted to touch on what Mihály said about what citizens feel when it's time to see these results and involve citizens in this social supervision control. So I'd like to finalize with that, and I'm also going to share the document. It's available in Spanish, but we'd be happy to have this conversation in English if you'd like to. I'm going to share it in the chat, and thank you so much.
Adriana, for your presentation. I think it clearly highlights some of the transparency gaps in public works contracts, and also the potential risks that I think could be applied and you could see in other contexts, not only in Colombia. And it's also an example of how open contracting data can be analyzed by civil society to generate actionable recommendations. So far we've discussed about different procurement interventions and their effect. And our next panelist will speak about equity and inclusion in procurement. So I want to introduce you to Scarlett George, who leads work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has developed different research projects precisely to assess gender equality and social inclusion practices in public contracting in different countries. She will present a framework that can help governments globally assess how inclusive their procurement policies, regulations, and practices are. So thank you so much for joining us, Scarlett.
Hi, and thank you so much, Camila. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. So yeah, as Camila said, I'm here to talk about gender equality and social inclusion in public procurement, and specifically kind of looking at a framework on how to assess what we're going to call GESI from now on, just to make it a bit shorter. And I'd also like to mention my colleague who also wrote this with me, well, one of my old colleagues at Oxford Insights is here, and her name is Jasmine. And if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat and she can kind of answer them as we go. So just on that next slide, I'm going to be talking about just what I'll be talking about in the presentation. So first, I'm going to be defining gender equality and social inclusion, GESI, in procurement, and then kind of why it's so important, the aim of the framework, and then why conduct an assessment. So on that next slide, we have defining GESI in public procurement. So if we kind of take an overall understanding of this, what we can see is that, you know, how we can define it is looking at requirements and procedures that ensure fair access, competition, and benefits for marginalized and disadvantaged groups. But then we can actually split the definition into two, because, you know, when we're looking at procurement, there's kind of two sides to things. Is the kind of practices and policies within government, and then there's also the kind of products and services that have been procuring. So we've split these into two separate parts of the definition. So that first one is looking at enacting GESI practices and policies throughout the procurement process. So GESI policies really need to be implemented throughout the procurement process to ensure that all through the procurement lifecycle, buyers and suppliers are actively being sensitive to GESI issues and empowering women and socially excluded groups. So just a couple of examples of kind of like what this could look like is things like ensuring to hire a diverse procurement team on the buyer's side, employing the use of quotas to enable women-owned businesses to more easily win tenders, or require bidders to demonstrate commitment to GESI principles, just for example. And as I said, there's that second part of the definition. So that's procuring products and services which adhere to GESI standards. This could mean, you know, these products and services really need to be accessible to all. So again, a couple of examples could include kind of ensuring computers have all the accessibility requirements for users. Online services can be accessed by all, And this includes people with disabilities, for example, such as dyslexia. So on that next slide, I'm going to talk about why GESI needs to be a public procurement focus. So public services really need to be inclusive. If diversity is not considered kind of in the language, processes, policies, the public services provided will not be inclusive. So, and then we're looking kind of at the purchasing power of governments and how they are really well placed to promote equity. Governments are best placed actors due to their huge purchasing power to promote quality through procurement. So by setting inclusivity standards for suppliers to adhere to, governments can actually foster a more inclusive commercial and by extension, social ecosystem. And we can really look at this in terms of kind of a stickler issue. Procurement can be used to promote quality in the public sphere, but to be effective, procurement itself actually needs to be inclusive. So just on that next slide, what I'm going to be talking about kind of is the aim of this framework. And just to give you kind of some context as to why we created this framework. So first of all, I was doing some work with the UK Government Digital Service and looking at gender equality and social inclusion. And during this work, I really noticed there was kind of a gap in the market. There were no GESI-focused procurement frameworks out there to really help the governments assess how GESI-friendly they are in their procurement processes and policies. So that's why we really wanted to create one. And during this work, we actually did create a quantitative framework, which you can access on the Oxford Insights website. And this is to help governments better understand what quantitative data needs to be collected to help to make informed decision and policy changes. But you know, that's not enough when it comes to procurement. We really need to hear from people. We really need to hear from the users and suppliers. You know, if it's women-owned businesses, what barriers are they facing? And so that's why we really wanted to create a qualitative framework, and this is what we did thanks to the research fund from OCP. So on the next slide, I talk about the qualitative framework, and the aim of this is to help governments better understand the needs of their users, whether they are suppliers, buyers, or service users. So the framework will help assessors, and that could be consultants that are brought in externally from government, but it could also be internal government assessors. Either group can use it, and this framework helps them ask the right questions and collect the information they need to make informed recommendations to enable governments to become more GESI friendly. So on this next slide, I talk about just kind of there's a great overview here of kind of what the framework includes. So there are three kind of larger categories that we include, and that's policies, laws and regulations, government capacity and internal tools, accountability and transparency. So within each category, there are sub-indicators that detail how governments can assess that particular aspect of their procurement system through a gender equality and social inclusion lens. So after an assessment is done with using the framework, the aim is to create a step-by-step guide on how to increase participation of underrepresented groups in a government's procurement process. So now I'm going to be talking about why conduct an assessment on this next slide. And then one more slide. So why the reasons we can, you know, kind of why it's so good for governments to conduct assessment. Well, first of all, it kind of sets a benchmark, and that enables governments to kind of track progress. So you can, you know, carry out an assessment, and then a few years down the line, once new policies and laws have been implemented to help these groups more easily participate in public procurement, we can, you know, redo the assessment and see if these changes have actually created the right kind of progress, what we really wanted to change. The idea is also to have these you know, assessments published openly, creating that transparency. So citizens and other organizations can participate and can really understand, you know, what the government's doing in order to be more GESI friendly. It also creates like a feedback loop with suppliers and buyers. So a huge part of the framework is really encouraging governments to go out and speak to their suppliers and ask them, what barriers are you facing? How can we do better? How can we make this easier for you? And really understand their lived realities, which we think is so important. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, it helps create detailed and practical policy recommendations that can be made based on the results of the assessment. So just on that final slide, it's just to thank you all for listening and for coming to this talk. And yeah, if you would like to contact us, please do. My name's Scarlett, and my colleague, as I said, she's in the chat, Jasmine. We'll also be holding another webinar on December 1st, where we'll be going over the framework in more detail and including some experts and some other experts in gender equality and social inclusion in public procurement. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Scarlett, for your presentation. And just a reminder that, as Scarlett said, this is a framework that is available for everyone that wants to implement it. So our final speaker today, Saeed, is a co-founder of Follow Taxes, which is an NGO that tracks government projects and simplifies procurement data as a tool against bribery and corruption, and as a key to enhance service delivery in Nigeria. And in our final presentation today, we want to showcase research that focus on evaluated some OGP commitments related to open contracting in states in Nigeria and how they have been implemented in practice and some of the challenges they face. So welcome, Saeed. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for making time to be part of this. We really appreciate your effort and the time you all put to be part of this. So the way we try to identify is the gaps in the effectiveness of public procurement across Nigerian subnational states, a case study of access and utilization. Our main focus in Follow Taxes and what we do with OC is how do we bridge that gap from numbers to results, not just about open the procurement data, how does it translate to service delivery? How do we make sure more citizens are being carried along? And this being the second action research, this we try to expand more to understand to what extent are these going to be utilized and data that is made open. From the first presenter, he made it clear and also ranked Nigeria amongst the countries that try to make the project. There's no effective implementation towards it. Now, it's one of the major issues in some of the African countries and some of the developing nations in which they come up, okay, at schools, we're going to make regulations, we're going to make policies to make things better, reduce corruption. But in reality, how it linked to results and how it changed things has always been the issue. Now, in our research, adopted a major, first I want to apologize, I'm presenting from the phone, so I don't have a slide presentation, but all the full research is on our Facebook page and Twitter page, and so you can please download to check and see. Okay, so we tried to adopt a system of mixed method where we looked at all both qualitative and quantitative, where we try to interview using KII to interview government officials in key agencies that provide either procurement or provide services. And also we then take a series of quantitative methods where we take surveys from civil societies, business members, and all, try to see what extent do they relate to this information. And what we found is actually very sounding, because it further helps us guide how to what extent is this utilized. And our findings, we try to expand, include the activities around Jesse. To what extent are people from secluded communities are included in procurement? Because as Jasmine said, poor procurement processes actually increase the poverty gap and also further put women down and also people from secluded communities. So it became clear that the countries and the states that we studied, most of the states commit to public procurement processes where they try to follow the disbursement links that are linked to a certain World Bank project, but most of them lack commitment to transparency and accountability tools and that as machineries to ensure sustainability. So you find that the procurement law may be there, you find that there's a website to put some of the procurement data out, but there's less enforcement to make sure that every other person who's supposed to put procurement out is there, and also citizens who are supposed to be engaging the procurement data are not aware. Now, even though some of the states have procurement law in place, the understanding that the procurement data is to be made public is not known and adhered to some of the MDA. So this is even within the state's apparatus. So you go the public procurement entity and you discuss with them, you take an interview from them, and they tell you it's a set law. Everybody's supposed to put all procurement data out and put it on public. But if you just go to jump the fence to the next agency and you are asking someone from Ministry of Health, how are you doing about putting procurement data public? The next thing he will tell you that I don't know, I'm supposed to put public procurement data public. Now, this and we felt it actually things that we need to work through the action research to create a result about it. Also, there is lack of awareness on policies, frameworks, and manuals to guide citizens and government officials on exactly how to engage those data. Now, the data may be there, it may be public, it may be online, but how many of the civil citizens who are supposed to be utilizing the public procurement data and utilize it to follow or make sure that it yields to service delivery? So that way the gap. For example, there may be a public procurement data out, maybe even to some extent with an attempt to meet up with an OCDA standard where it says, okay, we're supposed to provide a hospital or a cottage hospital or a primary health care in a certain community. Now, the people in that certain community may not even be aware that information is public, that's one. They don't know that the information is put on the website, that's two. So they don't even know whether what they need to do to track this activity and to make sure it is on that result. But where the issue is, it's already there. So, and unless this is done right, unless the information is put in place, it can't work. So it has to find, so these are some of the things we actually found. Also, there's a lack of platform to support the e-procurement system and for a timely and qualitative releases. Most of the states are just joining into the e-procurement system. They're trying to see at what extent they're going to be bringing out most of the information out, but not all of them are well acquainted to understand what they need to do and how much knowledge. The lack of administrative and skills of both. But importantly, some of the things that was common in almost all of the states is how do they carry this little information they have on open contracting out to a system of sustainability, which we believe platforms like Open Government Partnership provide such a system, since it provides a system where both citizens and government create solutions, create out problems, see how do they get this result out. Unfortunately, some of these states, in fact, all of these states that we did, out of our activity, the action research that we followed later, some of them got to join the OGP at the national level, but when we started, none of them were in the government partnership, even at the national level. As in, they are not supporting the national country in implementing in itself. So now these are some of the things we found, and we sampled 6 states in doing this research, but after a series of discussions, we discovered that this is actually across almost every other state. And not long ago, I was having a discussion with someone from JAR who are also working on activities on how to join the OGP in itself and also improve on fiscal transparency around contracting and procurement. And they are also complaining on most of these are some of the issues that are actually lingering. So from the research, where we generally discovered is there's actually a certain degree of we want to do it. There's a certain degree of we want to create a certain law so that everybody will see as if we're trying to do it. But when it comes to practicability or something that will create a sustainability or create a result that matters, that will further take the create results that will change, that will improve things around the OGP are mostly missing. Some of the gaps we're facing in the OGP and some of the activities around the open contracting and also civil society itself that is forcing contraction in the civil space, especially in Africa and other developing nations, is people, even the citizens we are representing, don't feel that they are fully being represented. They don't feel, they don't see the results. Yes, NGOs may come in and say we have spent $30 million through this period, but some of them don't see the direct impact. And we believe closing the gaps that are hindering effective procurement will really change this narrative, because with this, it means there will be that sustainability, and with this, that connection. If there's a certain hospital that's going to be built, that hospital will be built because the procurement data is out and the citizens has pursued it and they've made sure the contractor has done the work. At the same time, if there's a school that needed to be fixed, this school get fixed. Now, all of these things we believe will close the gap and see some of the things we intend to carry forward as part of the activities of the action research, considering that from the beginning, we picked it as an action research. So how do we create a result that will really change the narrative, that will create a result? Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Said, for your presentation, which highlights the key challenges local states face when implementing this type of contracting reforms that can go from weaknesses in the legal frameworks or even lack of involvement of strategies with civil society and other communities. So I want to open the floor for questions. We have around 10 minutes for an open discussion, and I invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A function in the chat. But maybe to start the discussion, so all of you presented like different challenges in procurement. So I guess one of the questions is, how can we address some of the key gaps that we see in evidence, and what role does contracting data play into this? Is it lack of data? Is it more that, yeah, these interventions are not being implemented in underdeveloped countries? So I want to test the floor, and if any of you wants to answer these questions, feel free to jump in.
I would be happy to add to that. So thanks, Camilla. Yeah, I think that it definitely, in terms of gender and social inclusion, you know, having gender disaggregated data is extremely important. And we don't necessarily see people, you know, governments kind of asking these questions when they're collecting that quantitative data. And it's really important to kind of understand, you know, as we all know, who your suppliers are. And I think that when we're missing that data, it's really hard to make sure, you know, you're making the right policy changes and implementing the right things if we're not informed about you know, who is supplying and what areas are missing. I know that, for instance, when we were doing some of this work, we found that a lot of indigenous communities weren't able to supply to government in parts of the world, which is they're such an important part of a country. And so it's really important to make sure those groups can supply to government, and having that data is a key part of that.
Thank you so much, Scarlett. I'm not sure if any of the other speakers wants to add in terms of the key gaps and how we could address those.
Yes, I can add on two things. One, and if there is not even data out, we don't even have the right to make this discussion we're making now. All the analysis we made is because we can have access to certain form of data or not. Now, those things and the effectiveness of how it's being utilized, what extent did we access it, and to what extent did we simplify how people can use it to translate into service delivery has always been the key, and something that I think we all need to look into and see to what extent we change, especially around developing worlds.
Thank you so much, Said. I guess I want to ask you also, like, in terms, so for instance, Mihály, in the evidence paper, you mentioned some of the civic monitoring initiatives and their impact. But I guess the question is, what is preventing like more initiatives like this? Like, we have the civil society groups monitoring open contracting, but what is preventing or being able to see like more impact of these initiatives, or if the evidence currently is insufficient to see how this actually interventions could be more effective in practice?
Let me start from this point. The whole idea of open contracting globally is now the whole idea of open contracting plus expose open contracting data to a certain contracting data standard is like new in the second stage. Now, how many of the citizens are even aware that this is even possible? That is in itself. Even in some developed nations, you find difficulty in assessing some contracting data, or rather apathy of not wanting to even assess, because sometimes you believe even if you assess it, you won't get results. So some of the things to answer your question, that's actually delaying and not helping in the improvement existence is the poor knowledge of the existence of this data itself. Then second, to what extent are people aware on how best to engage? For some people, when they get the data, rather than constructively engaging, they engage antagonistically. Now, when you engage someone, he blocked you out, and next he delays the whole situation. Maybe you go to the results. So I believe one of the best things to do is, one, getting more and more civil societies, especially civil societies and academia, into open data, especially open data that is linked to open contracting or open infrastructural data that is linked, that can actually copy issues of corruption. And second, to also have more civil societies engage in advocacy, getting more people to understand how to engage the data and how to create results.
If you let me, there's something I would like to add to that appreciation is also about data quality. Sometimes we can have data available and we can also have a lot of studies and a lot of analysis, but if the data is not of a good quality, not only the analysis will take a longer time to process, but also it will be like less understandable to citizens. So I think that's something that we should be really aware of. And I think that e-procurement solves that in at least partially, but data quality, I think, is crucial here.
Thank you so much, Eliana and Saeed, for answering the question. And I guess definitely that is definitely a challenge when we talk about civic monitoring, in terms of not only when the data is available, how do we involve citizens, but if the data is available, then what quality does it have to be able to have more robust methodologies and civic monitoring initiatives. So I also, just to be wrapping up a bit on the discussion, I guess, what are the main challenges that you see? So we discussed about the topic of transparency in public contracts, about inclusion policies, and also maybe citizen involvement in these types of commitments. So I guess, what would you say are some of the main challenges that prevent some of these open contracting commitments or initiatives to be implemented effectively? And if you have some ideas, I guess you mentioned some in your presentation on how this could be implemented more effectively.
I didn't want to come in again because I don't want to be like I'm the only one in the room. No, but let's be practical. When you want more engagement around the data, you get the people to engage. And getting people to engage requires a lot of mobilization. And mobilization, not just vertically, but just or even horizontally. That is mobilization within the government itself, mobilization out of the government itself. Since the whole revolution of open data started, everybody has applied it based on where it works for him. If you go to it applied for academia, or if it's applied for a research, because it has a business connotation, people who utilizes it use it to make money. But when it comes to engaging for improved service delivery, mostly it has no money attached to it. The people who need it the most do not have access to the data, may not have the time to take it down because there's no direct financial benefit. So it requires a lot of mobilization. It requires a lot of discussions more like this. It requires letting out to bring out some of these key results that can be seen. What really changes from the last research? What did we really get that creates a result? Some of these small things put together will build that actionable result that will put in more people wanting to know more, and that will further bridge and more the gap. Just a little as an idea. So I linking it up, working with the open government partnership is one of the best things we can do, especially linking it to OGP locals. To what extent? Because OGP locals are much closer to the community. They are more closer to get to see more results that directly affect them. So we get to put it down to the grassroots, and we get more people engaged, especially at the grassroots, that will lead to results that matter.
I think that there is something that I would like to add to that appreciation. I mean, citizen mobilization is crucial here, but also political willingness. I mean, we have to tackle both at the same time in order to be able to really change like the landscape of procurement and how we can make a more advantage of open data, or maybe make public procurement more efficient. Sometimes citizens can be fully engaged, they can be fully interested, but if there is no political willingness whatsoever on implementing reforms, there's nothing. So I think we should tackle both at the same time. So, and I think that at least from a civil society perspective, it requires a lot of strategy to approach that.
Thank you all. Scarlett, you wanted to add something?
Oh yeah, just gonna say as well, I think when we worked on previously with government digital service in the UK, we worked in a number of different governments around the world, and one kind of really useful tool I found to engage government policymakers was kind of looking at the conventions that a lot of these governments had signed up to in terms of gender equality and social inclusion, and saying, you know, you have an obligation to ensure that you're working towards you know, these conventions and making sure that you're kind of like fulfilling people's rights. And a really easy way to do that is through procurement. So kind of like showing them what a good incentive that is, as well as you know, showing other incentives. I think that you know, there's some disagreement on kind of whether or not this is a good thing, but you can show, for instance, that gender equality and social inclusion and improvement in it in terms of public procurement can increase a country's GDP. So again, just kind of demonstrating the incentive mechanisms to get people interested, to create those champions within government so they can feel like they're actually, you know, working towards positive change.
Thank you so much, Scarlett, and everyone in the panel. I think we need to be wrapping up, but definitely we hope to keep this discussion moving forward. As I mentioned, OGP and OCP are working on an evidence paper that will be available in early 2022. And also you can see all the different reports and research projects that we presented here today. You can see them on the Woowa platform, but we will also be sharing those on our social media. So I want to thank you all for participating to our group of panelists here today, and also to the audience. And I invite you all to keep participating in the different activities that OGP Academy has prepared this week, and also to keep track of other open contracting events that we will be hosting in the coming weeks. So thank you so much for joining, and it's a pleasure to host this session.